The basin water had gone pink before Evelina Marchmont noticed her own hands were shaking. She knelt on the cold flagstones of the scullery, well past midnight, the single tallow candle guttering beside her, and scrubbed at the linen of her second-best gown, as though her life depended on it. In a sense, it did. If Lady Prudence Harlow woke to find blood on the hem of a dress belonging to the poor relation she had taken in out of duty rather than love, there would be no explanation Evelina could offer that would not end in her being turned out onto the road before sunrise. She rubbed harder. The stain thinned, spread, refused to vanish entirely, the way a secret refuses to vanish even when you have buried it as deep as you know how. She did not hear the door. She did not hear the soft, deliberate step of a man who had learned, through long practice and long grief, how to move through a house without being noticed. She only felt, all at once, the sense of being watched, the particular prickling stillness that comes when another person's eyes have found you in the dark. And when she turned, her heart lodged somewhere near her throat, she saw him in the doorway, one shoulder against the frame, his arm still bound in the strip of her own petticoat, watching her wash his blood from her dress, with an expression she could not read. "You should be resting," she whispered, furious that her voice betrayed her fear. "And you," he said quietly, "should not be on your knees at this hour, ruining your hands for my sake." He did not ask why she had not simply left him where she found him. He did not ask why she had not called for help, or fetched the constable, or done any of the sensible things a prudent young woman ought to have done upon finding a wounded stranger bleeding into the hedgerow at the edge of her aunt's property. He only watched her, and in his watching there was something far more dangerous than suspicion. There was recognition, as though he had been searching a long time for exactly this. A woman on her knees at midnight, protecting a man who had nothing to offer her, expecting nothing in return. Little did she know, he had already decided, 3 nights before, never to tell her the truth of who he was. Little did she know that this decision, made in a moment of exhaustion and gratitude, when he ought to have known better, would become the thing that nearly destroyed them both. 3 nights earlier, the storm had come without warning, the way storms in that part of Somerset always seemed to, rolling down off the hills so quickly that the sky was black before the birds had even finished their evening song. Evelina had been walking the western hedgerow with a basket of late blackberries, a chore her aunt considered beneath a proper young lady, but entirely suitable for a niece who ate her bread at another woman's table, and ought to be grateful for it, when she heard, over the first crack of thunder, a sound that did not belong to the wind. A man's voice, low and ragged, calling for help that he did not expect to receive. She should have run for the house. She told herself so, afterward, 100 times. Instead she had gone toward the sound, her skirts snagging on bramble, until she found him half fallen against the old stone wall that marked the edge of Harlow land. His coat dark and wet, in a way that had nothing to do with the rain. A gash along his ribs where a blade or a fall, she could not tell which, had opened him like a seam. He was not dressed like a gentleman. His coat was plain, unlined, the sort a clerk or a tutor might wear, and there was mud on his boots that suggested he had walked, or run, a very long way. When he lifted his head and looked at her through the rain, his eyes were the only thing about him that seemed wrong for the rest of the picture. Too steady, too assessing. The eyes of a man accustomed to being obeyed, even now, even bleeding into a hedgerow in the middle of nowhere. "Please," he said, and the plainness of the word, stripped of any of the command his eyes still carried, was what decided her. She could not take him to the house. Lady Prudence would have him removed at once, out of fear of scandal, out of fear that harboring a wounded stranger, likely a poacher, likely a deserter, likely a criminal, her aunt would say, and say it with the particular relish of a woman who enjoyed being right about the worst in people, might taint the family name just as her aunt was working so carefully to secure a match between Cassandra and whichever eligible gentleman could be lured to the county that season. So Evelina had done the only thing she could think to do. She had half carried, half dragged him to the old gardener's cottage at the far edge of the orchard, empty since Hollis had died the previous winter, and not yet let to anyone new, and there, by the light of a single candle stub she kept hidden for exactly the kind of night when she needed to escape her aunt's house and simply breathe, she had cleaned and bound his wound with strips torn from her own petticoat, her hands steadier than she had any right to expect, given that she had never in her life tended to more than a scraped knee. "You've done this before," he had said, watching her work, his voice tight with pain he was trying very hard not to show her. "I have not," she admitted. "But my mother nursed the sick in our parish before she died, and I watched her enough times to know that panic helps no one, and that a wound wants pressure and cleanliness before anything else." She had not meant to say so much. She rarely did, these days, having learned in the 4 years since her parents' deaths and her arrival at Harlow Grange that the less she said, the less her aunt found to criticize. But he had looked at her then with an attention so complete that she felt, absurdly, seen for the first time in longer than she could remember. "What is your name?" he asked. She hesitated. To give her name to a stranger, alone, at night, in an empty cottage, was the kind of thing that could ruin a woman entirely if it ever came to light. But something in his face, exhausted, pained, and yet oddly gentle, made the caution feel unnecessary. "Evelina," she said. "Evelina Marchmont." "Julian," he said, after a beat that she would later understand, though she could not have known it then, was the sound of a man deciding to lie. Julian Hale. It was not, of course, his name. His name was Julian Ashford, 9th Earl of Ravensmore, and 3 nights before he had climbed out of a window at his own betrothal ball, rather than stand another hour beside a woman his grandmother had chosen for him, with all the warmth of a woman selecting livestock. And he had ridden until his horse went lame, and then walked until a pair of highwaymen relieved him of what little he carried and left him bleeding in a hedgerow for his trouble. He had told himself, as Evelina bound his ribs with hands that trembled only slightly, that the lie was a small mercy, that a poor relation sheltering an ordinary wounded traveller risked far less than one sheltering an earl, that his rank would only frighten her, that it was kinder to let her believe him nobody at all. He did not yet understand that the lie was also, in its way, a gift he was giving himself. For the first time since his father's death had made him Earl of Ravensmore at 23, no one was watching him for what he might do with his title, his fortune, his name. Evelina Marchmont knelt beside him and saw only a man in pain, and tended him not because he was powerful, but because he was hurting. And Julian Ashford, who had not trusted a single person's motives toward him in 4 years, found that he did not want that particular kind of seeing to end. He should have told her the truth the moment he was well enough to walk. He told himself so every single day that he did not. For 11 days, Evelina came to the gardener's cottage before dawn and after dusk, carrying bread wrapped in cloth, cold meat pilfered from the larder when the cook was not looking, water for washing, and, though she would not have admitted this even to herself, an eagerness she had not felt in years, a lightness in her chest as she crossed the orchard in the grey half-light, that had nothing to do with duty, and everything to do with the way Julian Hale's face changed when he saw her coming. "You've brought me half your own breakfast again," he said one morning, examining the meagre portion of bread and cheese she'd set before him, with an expression that mixed amusement and something far more tender. "Your aunt does not feed her household generously, I think." "My aunt feeds Cassandra generously," Evelina said, before she could stop herself, and then flushed at her own bitterness. "Forgive me." That was unkind. "It was honest," Julian said. "I find I prefer honesty to kindness, when a person cannot manage both." She had laughed at that, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and he had watched her laugh the way a starving man might watch a fire, as though it were something he had forgotten he was allowed to want. He had spent 4 years surrounded by young women who laughed at everything he said whether or not it merited laughter, who agreed with every opinion he offered before he had finished offering it, who saw when they looked at him, not a man, but a title with a face attached. Evelina Marchmont disagreed with him 3 times in that single conversation, told him plainly that his opinion on the education of country girls was old-fashioned and faintly insulting, and brought him a second helping of bread anyway, when she saw that arguing with her had not dampened his appetite. He did not know, in that moment, that he was already lost. She did not know, in that moment, how dangerous it was to let herself hope. The days that followed settled into a rhythm neither of them spoke of aloud, for fear that naming it might break it. Evelina rose before the household stirred, carried what small comforts she could gather to the cottage at the orchard's edge, and stayed as long as she dared before duty called her back to Harlow Grange, and the endless small tasks her aunt found for idle hands. In between, there was Julian. Recovering, restless, and increasingly reluctant to let her go each time she rose to leave. "Tell me about your mother," he said one grey morning, watching her mend a tear in his borrowed shirt with quick, economical stitches. "You spoke of her nursing the sick. I should like to know more of the woman who raised a daughter capable of what you did for me." "She was kind in a way that cost her nothing to be," Evelina said slowly, surprised to find she wanted to answer, not the performed kindness of women who wish to be admired for it. She simply could not walk past suffering without doing something about it. "My father used to say she would have nursed the whole parish, through every fever in Somerset if he had let her, and he never once tried to stop her, though it left us poorer than we might have been." "She sounds like someone I would have liked very much," Julian said, and there was something wistful in it that made Evelina look up from her stitching. "You lost someone too," she said. It was not quite a question. "My mother. When I was 12. My father 4 years past, which is how I came to be Earl at 23, with no notion of how to be one properly. Surrounded by men twice my age, who resented taking instruction from a boy barely out of university, and a grandmother who decided, within a month of the funeral, that the fastest remedy for my inexperience was a swift and advantageous marriage." He said it lightly, the way men are taught to say heavy things, but Evelina had spent 4 years learning to hear what lay beneath a carefully light voice, and she heard the grief in it plainly. "Is that why you ran?" she asked. "From the betrothal ball?" He was quiet a long moment, turning the question over. "I ran," he said finally, "because I looked at the woman my grandmother had chosen, a perfectly amiable, perfectly suitable young woman, I should add, who deserves a husband who wants her for herself, and not for the alliance she represents. And I understood, quite suddenly, that I was about to spend the whole of my life being managed. My grandmother would choose my wife, my steward would choose my investments, my valet would choose my coat. And somewhere in the middle of all that choosing, the actual business of being a man who wanted things for his own reasons would simply stop happening. I did not plan to end up bleeding in a hedgerow, but I cannot say I am sorry it happened, given where it has led." Evelina did not trust herself to answer that directly, and so she busied herself instead with the last of the stitching, though her hands were not nearly as steady as she wished them to be. It was on the 7th day that he first made her laugh so hard she had to press her sleeve to her mouth to keep from being heard across the orchard, recounting, with wicked and precise mimicry, the manner in which a particular marquis of his acquaintance had once fainted dead away at the sight of a garden spider, only to insist afterward that he had merely been overcome by the heat. In December, in a stone hall with no fire lit, she laughed until her ribs ached, and when she finally caught her breath, she found him watching her again with that same unreadable warmth, and something in his expression made her go suddenly quiet. "What is it?" she asked. "Nothing," he said, though it plainly was not nothing. only that I have not heard a woman laugh like that. Like she had forgotten to guard herself while doing it, in longer than I can remember. Most women I know laugh as though they are being watched, even when they believe they are not. I forget myself around you, Evelina admitted, and then flushed, wishing immediately she had not said it aloud. I hope you never stop, he said quietly, and the moment stretched between them, taut and unbearably sweet, until the distant sound of the dinner bell at Harlow Grange broke it, and she fled the cottage with her heart hammering, in a way that had nothing at all to do with fear of discovery. It was on the 10th day, the day before the truth came out, that they came nearest of all to the words neither of them had yet dared to speak. She had come at dusk instead of dawn, later than usual, having been kept by one of her aunt's endless small errands, and found him standing at the cottage window, watching the last of the light fail over the orchard, his expression unguarded in a way she had not yet seen it. I was beginning to fear you would not come, he said, without turning. I would always come, she said, and heard, too late, how much of herself she had given away in the simple honesty of it. He turned then, and crossed the small room to stand before her, close enough that she had to tilt her chin to hold his gaze, close enough that she could hear the unsteadiness in his own breath. Evelina, he said, there is something I have been wanting to say to you, and I find myself afraid to say it, which is a novel experience for a man who has spent 4 years being afraid of very little at all. Her heart was beating so hard she was certain he must hear it. Say it, she whispered. But he did not then. His resolve failing him at the last moment, the old habit of caution reasserting itself, the unspoken lie of his name rising up between them like a wall, neither of them could yet see clearly enough to name. He touched her cheek instead, briefly, achingly gentle, and said only, soon, I promise you soon, and let her go, and she walked back to Harlow Grange in the deepening dark, not knowing that the very next morning would bring the truth crashing down upon them both before either was ready to bear its weight. Evelina had learned hope was a luxury she could not afford. Her mother had died of a fever when Evelina was 17. Her father, a country clergyman with more books than sense about money, dead within the year of a broken heart no physician could name on a certificate, and she had come to Harlow Grange with a single trunk and the clothes on her back, dependent entirely on the grudging charity of an aunt who reminded her, at least once a week, how fortunate she was to have a roof at all. Cassandra, 4 years her junior, and possessed of the kind of golden prettiness that made rooms go quiet when she entered them, had been raised to expect the world's admiration as her due. Evelina had been raised these past 4 years to expect nothing, and to be grateful for the nothing she received. So when Julian Hale looked at her as though she were the most interesting person he had met in years, asked her opinion and waited, genuinely waited to hear it, she told herself, sternly, every single night, that it meant nothing, that a wounded stranger, isolated and dependent on her kindness, would naturally attach himself to the only person showing him any, that she must not mistake gratitude for anything deeper. That hope, once again, was a door she had learned to keep shut. But hope, as it so often does, found the smallest crack and let itself in regardless. It was on the 9th day that he took her hand. She had been rebinding the wound along his ribs, which was healing cleanly now, the danger of fever past, and her fingers had brushed his side in a way that made them both go suddenly, entirely still. When she looked up, his eyes were already on her face, and there was something in them she had never had directed at her before, not by any man, not once in 23 years, something that made the cottage feel very small and very warm, despite the autumn chill leaking through the shutters. Evelina, he said, and her name in his voice sounded like something precious, something he had been saving. I owe you my life. You owe me nothing, she said, though her voice had gone unsteady. Anyone would have done the same. No, he said, with a quiet certainty that silenced her protest before she could finish it. Not anyone. You had every reason to leave me in that hedgerow, and every reason to fear the consequences of not doing so, and you chose kindness anyway, at real cost to yourself, expecting nothing in return. He reached out then and took her hand, the one still faintly stained, despite her scrubbing, with the ghost of his own blood, and pressed it, briefly to his lips. I do not know how to repay a debt like that. I am not certain it can be repaid. But I would like, very much, to try to deserve it. She had gone home that night unable to sleep, her hand burning where his mouth had touched it, and had lain awake turning over every word he'd said, searching for the trick in it, the catch. Because surely, a man did not look at a penniless poor relation the way Julian Hale had looked at her, without there being some misunderstanding, some mistake, some cruelty waiting on the other side of it. She did not yet know that the mistake was his, not hers, that he had let a lie stand for 9 days longer than honor should have allowed, because the truth would end something he had only just discovered he could not bear to lose. It was Cassandra who nearly ended it first, though not because she suspected the truth. "You've been slipping out at odd hours," her cousin said one afternoon, examining her own reflection in the drawing-room mirror, with the particular thoroughness of a woman preparing for a war she intended to win. "Mama noticed. She thinks you've taken up with one of the stable boys, which would be terribly common of you, Evelina, but I told her I doubted you had the nerve." "I go walking," Evelina said, keeping her voice as flat and uninteresting as she could manage. "For my health. For your health." Cassandra's reflection smiled, slow and knowing, and Evelina's stomach dropped, because her cousin's smile had never once, in 4 years, meant anything good for her. "How fortunate that your health requires walking in the direction of Hollis's old cottage. I saw you from my window, Evelina, 3 times this week." There was no honest answer that would not endanger Julian, and so Evelina did the only thing she could think to do. She lied, badly, claiming she liked the quiet of the orchard for reading, and watched Cassandra's smile sharpen into something that told her, with perfect clarity, that her cousin did not believe a word of it, and intended to find out the truth in her own time, in her own way, and use it however it best suited her. Evelina told Julian that evening that they must be more careful. She did not tell him she suspected her cousin's motives went beyond simple curiosity, that Cassandra collected other people's secrets the way some women collected jewelry. Not to keep safe, but to wear, publicly, whenever it served her, because to explain that fully would mean explaining 4 years of small cruelties she had trained herself not to dwell on. "Then let me go," Julian said instead, watching her face with the careful attention that had become, in these past days, as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. "I am well enough to travel. I should not put you at further risk." And here was the moment. She would think of it, later, 100 times, turning it over like a stone worn smooth with handling, when she might have let him go, when honesty and self-preservation both pointed toward the same door. Instead, she heard herself say, "Stay 1 more week. Until you're stronger," and knew, even as she said it, that strength had very little to do with her true reason. He stayed. What neither of them knew was that Julian's household had, by then, spent 9 days in a state of escalating alarm. His grandmother, the formidable dowager countess, had at first assumed his disappearance from the betrothal ball a temporary sulk, the sort of thing young men did when confronted with duty they found distasteful, and had told the assembled guests he had been called away on urgent business. But 9 days without word, without so much as a note, had transformed her irritation into genuine fear, and she had sent riders in every direction, offering reward for any word of the Earl of Ravensmore, last seen riding west from the ball in evening dress, with no coin, no papers, and no destination that anyone could name. It was one such rider, a sharp-eyed young man named Simmons, who had served the Ashford family since Julian's father's time, and knew the Earl's face better than most, who stopped at the Crossroads Inn, nearest Harlow Grange on the 12th day, and heard, from a talkative ostler, of a stranger seen limping through the fields a fortnight before, injured, asking after nothing in particular, who had not been seen since. Simmons rode for Harlow Grange within the hour. Evelina found Julian's letter, for he had, at last, written one, the previous night, in an unguarded moment of tenderness that felt, to him, like the beginning of honesty rather than an extension of the lie, tucked half beneath the cottage's single pillow when she arrived the following dawn with his breakfast, and though she had no right to read another person's private correspondence, his handwriting was so achingly familiar to her now, so like the hand that had written her small teasing notes tucked into the folds of returned linen, that she did not think before her eyes caught, unbidden, on a single line before he snatched the paper gently from her hands. I do not know how to tell her who I truly am, without losing what I have found. The words landed like a physical blow. Julian, she said, very quietly, who you truly are. He did not answer quickly enough. That, more than anything, was what told her the truth before he ever spoke it aloud. The long, terrible pause in which she watched every excuse and explanation cross his face and be discarded, one by one, because none of them would do, because there was no soft way to say what had to be said. My name, he said at last, is not Julian Hale. The cottage, which had felt for 11 days like the only safe and honest place in her narrow, careful world, suddenly felt like the site of the cruelest joke that had ever been played on her. Julian Ashford, he said, and his voice was steady even though his hands, she noticed distantly, were not. Earl of Ravensmore. I fled my own betrothal ball a fortnight ago, rather than marry a woman chosen for me by my grandmother, and highwaymen left me bleeding in your hedgerow, and I let you believe me a common traveller because— he stopped. Started again. Because for the first time in 4 years, someone looked at me and saw a man, not a title, and I was too much of a coward to risk losing that. You let me believe you were nobody, Evelina said, and her voice, when it came, sounded very far away to her own ears. For 11 days. You let me risk everything, my place in this house, my reputation, the little I have left in this world, to protect a man who had a household of 40 servants searching for him this very moment. And you said nothing. Evelina, do not, she said, stepping back from him as though his touch, which she had welcomed only the day before, might burn her now. Do not say my name as though nothing has changed. Everything has changed. You are an Earl, Lord Ravensmore, and I am a poor relation who mends linen for her bread. And whatever this was, her voice broke, finally, on the word, whatever I let myself believe this was. It cannot have been real, because you built it on a lie. The only lie was my name, he said, and there was real desperation in his voice now, the desperation of a man watching something irreplaceable slip through his hands. Everything else, every conversation, every hour, every reason I have to be grateful to you, none of that was false. I am the same man who told you your opinions on the education of country girls were correct, and mine were foolish. I am the same man who ate your bread and was glad of it. The only thing I hid was a title, Evelina, not a heart. She wanted, desperately, to believe him. That was the worst of it. Not that she doubted his sincerity in this particular moment, but that she doubted her own judgment entirely, because she had believed, for 11 days, that she understood exactly who he was, and had been wrong about the single largest fact of his existence. If she had been wrong about that, what else might she be wrong about? What else might a woman with her inexperience, her isolation, her desperate hunger for a single person to see her clearly, have mistaken for something it was not? I need to think, she said, and left him standing alone in the cottage with the letter still in his hand. She thought of the letter she had glimpsed, of the words I do not know how to tell her who I truly am without losing what I have found, and turned them over until they lost their shape entirely, until she could not decide whether they were proof of a man's cowardice, or proof of a man's fear of losing something genuinely precious. Her mother had once told her that grief and love often wore the same face in the dark, and she had never understood the saying until now, sitting alone in the cottage doorway, with her whole certain world upended in a single afternoon. "I do not ask you to forgive me today," Julian said quietly, from where he had not moved, watching her with the particular stillness of a man who understood that any wrong word now might cost him everything. "I ask only that you allow me the chance to earn it. I have spent 4 years being wanted for a title I did not choose, and did not for a long while know how to carry with any grace. You are the first person who ever wanted the man beneath it, and I was too great a coward for 11 days to risk telling you the truth and finding out whether that wanting would survive it. That was unforgivable of me, but it was not unloving. I would ask you to believe those two things can exist together. Difficult as that may be, you do not understand," she said, and her voice cracked at last, all the composure she had been holding through sheer force of will finally giving way. "You can afford to be found out, my lord. A scandal touches you and the world calls it an adventure, a story to be told at dinners for years to come. The Earl who nearly died and was saved by a devoted young woman. A scandal touches me, and I have nothing left, no fortune, no family name of consequence, no home but the one my aunt allows me under sufferance. I have spent 4 years learning exactly how little protection a woman without means possesses, and you have just handed my cousin the exact weapon she has been waiting 4 years to use against me. And you did it without once considering what it might cost me, because you have never in your life had to consider such a cost for yourself." He absorbed this without flinching, though something in his face tightened, as though the words had found their mark precisely where she intended them to. "You are right," he said finally. "I did not consider it, because I have never had to. That is its own kind of blindness, and I am ashamed of it. But I will not compound it by disappearing now and leaving you to bear the consequences alone. Whatever comes of this, Evelina, I do not intend to let you face it unprotected. That much, at least, is within my power to promise." It was a promise she did not yet know whether to trust, but she noticed, even in the depths of her hurt, that he had not once asked her to simply overlook what he had done, had not once suggested that his rank entitled him to easy forgiveness. He had only asked for the chance to prove himself worthy of a trust he had already broken, and there was something in the plain humility of that request that she could not quite bring herself to dismiss outright, however much her wounded pride wished to. She did not get the luxury of thinking for long. Simmons found the cottage within the hour, and by midday the quiet lane before Harlow Grange was crowded with liveried outriders, and a carriage bearing a crest that made Lady Prudence's face go through 3 distinct shades of astonishment before settling on naked, calculating delight. The Earl of Ravensmore, found alive, recovering from his ordeal at a cottage on her own land, was news that would travel through the county within the day, and Lady Prudence, whose entire strategy for the season had rested on securing Cassandra's future through advantageous connection, understood at once that fortune had delivered directly into her hands the single greatest prize the district had to offer. "My lord," she said, sweeping into a curtsy so deep it nearly toppled her. "What an honor, what an unimaginable honor, to have sheltered you unknowing beneath our very roof. You must allow us to nurse you properly now that your identity is known. Cassandra, my dear, ring for tea at once. The Earl will wish to be comfortable." Evelina, standing at the edge of the room, watched her cousin's face transform in real time from bored indifference to calculating interest, watched Cassandra take in the Earl of Ravensmore's title, his fortune, his unmarried state, and understood, with a sick lurch, exactly what was about to happen. Cassandra had spent 4 years perfecting the art of wanting whatever would most improve her own position, and an Earl, conveniently unattached and conveniently grateful to the household that had sheltered him, was precisely the sort of prize her cousin had been raised to pursue without hesitation or conscience. "You are too kind, Lady Prudence," Julian said, and his eyes found Evelina's across the room even as he spoke the polite formula. "But it was not your household's care I owe my recovery to. It was your niece's." The room went very still. "Miss Marchmont," Julian continued, and there was something steel-edged beneath the courtesy now, something that made Lady Prudence's smile falter, "found me bleeding in your hedgerow a fortnight ago, and might reasonably have left me there, or reported me to the constable as a vagrant, or done any number of things that would have cost her nothing and me my life. Instead, she carried me, alone, to shelter, and tended my wounds herself, and fed me from her own portion, and asked nothing in return, not knowing, all the while, that I was anyone worth the risk. I owe her my life, Lady Prudence. I think the whole of this household should know it." Evelina wanted, desperately, to feel vindicated. Instead, she felt only exposed. Every eye in the room suddenly upon her, Cassandra's gaze in particular sharpening into something dangerous. Something that promised this was not the last Evelina would hear of it. She was right to be afraid. Cassandra came to her that night, after the household had settled, with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "How resourceful of you," her cousin said, "to have found yourself an earl in a hedgerow. Though I confess, Evelina, I wonder how a poor relation with no chaperone came to spend 11 days alone with an unmarried man in an empty cottage, without a single soul the wiser. Mamma would be very interested to hear the particulars, I think. So would the county, once the story makes its way through the usual channels. And stories of this kind always do make their way through the usual channels, don't they? 11 days. Alone, how very interesting people will find that, once it's known." "Nothing improper occurred," Evelina said, though her voice shook with the unfairness of having to defend herself for an act of pure mercy. "I believe you," Cassandra said, in a tone that made clear she did not, or did not care whether it was true. "But belief is not the same as reputation, cousin, and reputation is the only currency women like you and I actually possess. I wonder how eager Lord Ravensmore will remain, once every drawing-room in the county is whispering that his rescuer spent 11 unchaperoned nights alone with him. Earls do not marry ruined women, Evelina, however grateful they may feel in the moment. Gratitude fades. Scandal does not." The threat was clear enough that Evelina did not need it explained twice. Cassandra intended to let the story spread, carefully, deniably, through servants and neighbors rather than her own mouth, until Evelina's reputation was damaged enough that any claim she might have on Julian's affection became a liability rather than an asset, leaving the field clear for Cassandra herself to press her own advantage as the household's beautiful, unscandalized daughter. Evelina did not sleep that night. She lay awake calculating, with the cold clarity of a woman who had spent 4 years learning to survive on very little. Exactly how much damage a whispered scandal could do to a girl with no fortune and no family name worth protecting, and understood that the calculation did not favor her. If she stayed silent and let Julian's interest continue, she risked exactly the ruin Cassandra promised. If she withdrew now, refused him, put safe distance between herself and a man whose rank made every hour in his company a public event, she might yet preserve enough of her reputation to survive. She chose in the grey hour before dawn to withdraw. She did not tell Julian why. She simply began, over the following days, to be busy whenever he called, to answer his notes with shorter and shorter replies, to find reasons why a walk in the orchard was inconvenient, why tea in the drawing-room could not be managed, why she was needed elsewhere whenever he was present. She watched the confusion in his face turn, slowly, to hurt, and told herself it was necessary, that a man of his rank could not understand what it cost a woman like her to be seen too often in his company, that protecting herself was not the same as not caring. In those 5 days, she caught him watching her across rooms she had entered specifically because she believed him elsewhere. At breakfast, in the hall, once through the drawing-room window, as she crossed the garden with a basket of mending she did not truly need to carry that far. Each time, she looked away first, telling herself it was prudence and knowing. In the small, honest corner of her heart she could not quite silence, that it was closer to cowardice. She had survived 4 years at Harlow Grange by making herself small enough that no one thought to notice her at all, and it terrified her now to discover how thoroughly one fortnight had undone that careful discipline, how she had let herself become, however briefly, a woman who expected to be looked for, and now did not know how to bear being looked for by a man she had decided, for her own protection, to refuse. It was Julian, finally, who cornered her in the library on the 5th day of her retreat, closing the door behind him with a quiet firmness that left no room for her usual excuses. "Tell me what I have done," he said, "and I will correct it. Tell me what you fear, and I will address it. But do not simply vanish from me without explanation, Evelina. Not after everything he stopped, visibly gathering himself. Not after what I believed we had built together." "You have done nothing," she said, and it was true, which somehow made it worse. "It is not you I fear, my lord. It is what the world will make of me, if I continue to be seen in your company." My cousin has made her intentions on that subject very clear. She told him then the whole of it. Cassandra's threat, the calculation of scandal, the plain arithmetic that a poor relation's reputation could not survive what a wealthy young woman's easily would. Julian listened with a stillness that frightened her slightly, his jaw tightening with each detail, and when she had finished he was silent for a long moment before he spoke. "Your cousin," he said, "has mistaken me for a man who values his own comfort over justice. That is a mistake I intend to correct publicly, and soon. My lord, Julian," he corrected, gently but firmly. "You called me Julian for 11 days when you believed I was nobody. I would very much like you to go on doing so, now that you know I am somebody, because the man you cared for in that cottage and the man standing before you now are the same man, Evelina. Whatever your cousin would have you believe, and whatever fear has convinced you to believe about your own worth." He did not press her further that day, but 3 days later, at a dinner Lady Prudence had assembled specifically to display the Earl of Ravensmore's continued presence in her household, and, not incidentally, to display Cassandra at her most carefully arranged advantage, Julian did something that no one in the room, least of all Evelina, expected. He stood, midway through the second course, and requested the attention of the table. "I find myself obliged," he said in the pleasant, carrying voice of a man well accustomed to commanding rooms, "to correct a misunderstanding that I believe has been circulating in this county, regarding the circumstances of my rescue a fortnight past. I understand that some have suggested impropriety in the 11 days Miss Marchmont spent nursing me back to health, days during which, I will remind this table, I was in no condition to walk unassisted, let alone conduct myself with anything but the deepest gratitude toward the woman who saved my life at considerable personal risk. I would like it understood, plainly and for the last time, that Miss Marchmont's conduct throughout was beyond reproach, that any suggestion otherwise is both false and unworthy of repetition, and that I hold her in the highest possible regard, a regard, I will say further, that I hope will only deepen with time, should she permit it." The table had gone utterly silent. Lady Prudence's face had drained of colour. Cassandra's fork had stopped halfway to her mouth, her carefully arranged composure cracking visibly at the edges. Furthermore, Julian continued, and now his eyes had found Evelina's, and held them. "I understand that certain parties in this household have suggested that a woman's reputation is a fragile thing, easily traded upon by those with less honour than sense. I would remind this table that I am an earl, and that my good opinion is not without consequence in this county. Any further attempt to damage Miss Marchmont's character will be understood by me as a personal insult," and answered accordingly. Evelina sat frozen through the whole of it, her face burning. half with mortification at being so publicly discussed, and half with an emotion so much larger and warmer that she could hardly name it. The particular disbelieving joy of watching a powerful man spend his power, deliberately and without hesitation, in defense of a woman who had nothing to offer him in return but herself. Cassandra did not speak again for the rest of the meal. Lady Prudence's carefully constructed strategy for the season collapsed, silently and completely, somewhere between the second course and the third. Cassandra rose from the table shortly after, murmuring some excuse about the heat, and did not return for the remainder of the meal. Lady Prudence, for her part, spent the rest of dinner in a state of visible recalculation, her earlier triumph curdling visibly into the recognition that whatever advantage she had hoped to gain from the Earl's presence in her household had just been declared, publicly and irrevocably, to belong to her niece and not her daughter. She said nothing more on the subject that evening, though Evelina noticed, in the days that followed, a new and careful courtesy in her aunt's manner that had never existed before, the particular respect of a woman recalculating exactly how much power the person before her now possessed. Afterward, in the quiet of the garden, where Evelina had fled the moment she could reasonably excuse herself, Julian found her again. "You did not have to do that," she said, when he came to stand beside her at the edge of the dark lawn. "I did," he said simply. "I let a lie stand for 11 days because I was afraid the truth would cost me something I had only just found and did not yet know how to value properly. I will not compound that cowardice by staying silent now, while your reputation is threatened by the very family who ought to be protecting it. I have spent 4 years being courted for my title by women who cared nothing for the man beneath it. Evelina, you cared for the man before you knew the title existed. I do not intend to let anything, not scandal, not your fear, not my own past cowardice, take that from either of us without a fight. I withdrew from you," she said quietly, "not because I stopped caring, but because I was afraid. Afraid of exactly what happened tonight, of being spoken of, examined, weighed in front of a room full of people who have never once looked at me and seen anything worth valuing." "I looked at you," Julian said, "and saw everything worth valuing, before I ever knew your name. I am asking you now, with my name fully known to you, and yours known fully to me, and nothing left hidden between us. Will you let yourself be seen? Not merely by me, though I would be glad of that above anything else in this world, but by yourself. Will you let yourself believe that you are worth the risk I have just taken, and the risk I am asking you to take in return?" She thought of 11 days in a cottage, of blood scrubbed from linen in the dark, of a life spent making herself small and quiet and grateful, so that no one would ever have cause to send her away. She thought of the particular dignity it had cost her to kneel on cold stone at midnight and refuse to abandon a wounded stranger simply because kindness was dangerous and might cost her everything. "Yes," she said, and the word came out steadier than she expected, steadier than 4 years of careful smallness had any right to allow. "Yes, Julian, I will let myself be seen." There remained one trial Evelina had not anticipated, and it arrived in the form of the Dowager Countess herself, who descended upon Harlow Grange a week after the betrothal was privately settled, her carriage rattling up the drive, with all the ceremony of a monarch arriving to inspect a disappointing province. She was a tall, spare woman with silver hair dressed with severe precision and eyes, so like her grandson's that Evelina felt, for one unsteady moment, as though Julian himself were studying her from across the drawing-room. "So," the Dowager said, without preamble, once tea had been poured and the requisite pleasantries exhausted, "you are the young woman who has upended 4 years of very careful planning." "I did not set out to upend anything, my lady," Evelina said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage. "I set out only to help a stranger who was bleeding in a hedgerow." The Dowager studied her over the rim of her teacup with an intensity that made Evelina long to look away, and made her, out of sheer stubbornness, refused to do so. Julian's father married for love, you know. Everyone told him it was folly, that a man of his position owed his family a match of consequence rather than affection, and he ignored every one of them and married my son's mother anyway, and I do not believe I ever saw two people happier in the whole of my life, nor a marriage that better served this family's interests in the end, whatever the gossips predicted. She set down her cup with a small, precise click. I had convinced myself, after his death, that sentiment was a luxury this family could no longer afford, that the next match must be a purely strategic one, chosen with the head and not the heart, to steady what his loss had unsettled. I see now that I mistook caution for wisdom, and very nearly cost my grandson the one thing that might actually have steadied him. My lady, Evelina began, uncertain where the conversation was leading. I am not in the habit of apologizing, Miss Marchmont, and I do not intend to begin the habit today, the dowager said, with the ghost of something that might, on a less formidable woman, have been called a smile. But I will say this. My grandson wrote to me 3 days past, informing me of his intentions, and I have known that boy since he was a squalling infant placed in my arms before he had opened his eyes. And I have never once in 23 years heard him write of anything with the particular steadiness he wrote of you. I came here prepared to test your character, Miss Marchmont, and to send you away with a very generous settlement and a very firm suggestion that you forget my grandson's acquaintance entirely, if I found you wanting. I confess I no longer intend to do either. It was, Evelina would reflect later, as close to a blessing as the formidable old woman was ever likely to give. And it was enough. When the dowager rose to take her leave that afternoon, she paused at the door and looked back at Evelina with an expression that had softened, almost imperceptibly, into something like approval. He tells me you scrubbed his blood from your own gown at midnight, rather than risk anyone discovering him, she said. That is not the act of a woman chasing a title, Miss Marchmont. That is the act of a woman with a conscience larger than her circumstances have ever permitted her to exercise. See that my grandson deserves it. I shall be watching to make certain that he does. The betrothal, when it was announced a fortnight later, was the talk of the county for a full season. The Earl, who had nearly died in a hedgerow, saved by a poor relation with nothing to recommend her but her own steady courage, chosen above every eligible young woman his grandmother had paraded before him, chosen specifically, publicly, and without a moment's hesitation, once the truth of both their hearts had finally been permitted into the light. Cassandra married, within the year, a baronet of modest fortune and modester charm, and never again attempted to trade in another woman's reputation without first considering the cost. Lady Prudence, to her credit, learned at last to treat her niece with something approaching respect, though whether from genuine change of heart or simple recognition of which way the wind now blew, Evelina never troubled herself to determine. She had, by then, very little need of her aunt's good opinion. In the months between the betrothal and the wedding, Evelina discovered that being seen, once permitted, did not stop at a single revelation, but kept unfolding, gently and continually, in 100 small ways she had never expected. Julian wrote to her nearly every day she was not at Ravensmoor itself. Letters full of the ordinary business of his days. A dispute among his tenants he had settled more fairly than his steward advised. A mare in the stables who had taken a liking to him, and none of the grooms. A library he wished her to see, because he suspected she would love it as much as he did, and she found, reading them, that the man in the letters was exactly the man she had tended in the cottage, unhurried and honest, and quietly attentive to things other people overlooked. There was no second lie waiting to be discovered, no further title or secret concealed beneath the first. He had given her at last the whole of himself, plainly and without reservation, and she found that the giving of it had cost him something too, a certain guardedness he had worn since his father's death, which softened, letter by letter, into something she recognized as trust. She wrote back just as honestly, telling him of the small triumphs and small griefs of her days at Harlow Grange, of her aunt's grudging new courtesy, of a moment when she had found herself laughing aloud, alone in the garden, over some foolishness he had written, and had not cared in the slightest who might have seen her do it. She had spent 4 years learning to make herself invisible for her own safety. She spent that autumn learning, slowly and not without stumbling, how to take up space in the world again, to state her opinions plainly at her aunt's table, to walk where she pleased without apology, to accept at last that she was permitted to want things for herself, and to say so aloud. On the morning of her wedding, Evelina stood before the same small mirror in which she had once examined, with despair, the stubborn pink stain that would not quite wash from her second-best gown, and found that she could look at her own reflection now without flinching. She thought of the girl who had knelt on cold stone at midnight, terrified and resolute, protecting a secret she did not yet understand would change the whole of her life, and felt, for the first time in 4 years, something that was not quite grief, and not quite fear, but a kind of fierce, quiet pride. She had washed the blood from her dress in secret, certain that discovery meant ruin. She had not known then that she was already seen, fully, completely, and without a single condition attached, by the one person whose seeing would come, in time, to matter more than any others. He had watched her kneel in the dark, and choose kindness over caution, had watched her hands shake with fear, and steady themselves with purpose, had watched her give away her own bread, and her own safety, to a stranger who could offer her nothing in return, and had understood, long before she permitted herself to hope it, that he had found in that scullery, at midnight, the one heart in all of England he intended to spend the whole of his own life proving worthy of. Julian was waiting for her at the end of the aisle, and when their eyes met across the small country chapel, crowded now with a household that had once overlooked her entirely, she saw in his face the same steady, unwavering attention that had first undone her in a gardener's cottage a lifetime ago. The look of a man who had seen everything, the plainest and the most frightened and the most courageous parts of her, and chosen, deliberately and forever, to stay. "I told you once," he murmured when she reached him, too quietly for anyone else to hear, "that I preferred honesty to kindness, when a person could not manage both." "And now?" she whispered. "Now," he said, taking her hand. The same hand he had once pressed to his lips in a cottage, lit by a single candle, the hand that had scrubbed his blood from her own dress in secret, rather than see him suffer. "I find I no longer have to choose. I have both, in you, and I intend to spend the rest of my life grateful for it." The vicar cleared his throat, gently, and the ceremony began, and somewhere in the back of the small chapel, in a household that had once considered her too plain, too poor, and too inconvenient to be worth its notice, Evelina Marchmont became Evelina Ashford, Countess of Ravensmore, not because a title had been given to her, but because a heart had recognized her own long before it knew her name, and had refused, ever since, to look away.